Hey, everybody. Welcome to Hannah Stevenson's session on concurrent session D. And this is a great title. Great title. This is intentionally quieting your internal voice, teaching and learning with radical listening and mindfulness, right? Sometimes I get in such a rush that when a student says something to me, I don't hear what they're actually saying to me. And that cuts off my ability to be helpful. As an instructor, overall, I want to be helpful. So Hannah stepped up last minute. We had somebody who decided that they couldn't do it and went to a quad side session instead. And our Sam Clem in our office stepped up. It's like, I got this woman and she is awesome. And Hannah presented a bunch of different things that she could talk about. And she said this, and I was like, this is exactly what I need. And I hope that everyone else is excited as I am about this topic. So instead of stealing more time from Hannah, I'm going to turn it over to her. Get started.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And oops, I'm going to do this one. I am actually going to share for accessibility for you all my slides so that you have these and all of that information to return to afterwards. And oops, sorry, go this way. Okay. As Shelly told you guys, this is intentionally quieting your internal voice, teaching and learning with radical listening and mindfulness. My name is Hannah, and I'm a graduate instructor and a PhD student here at USU. My email is right there as well. If you ever want to email me after the fact, I am totally open to talking about this more. This is a fairly new topic that I've kind of gotten interested in, I'd say in the last year or so. So I've really, in the year that I've been at USU, kind of hammered home to my students this idea about radical listening. And with that came also reflecting upon my own pedagogy, my own kind of life choices, to see where I could kind of implement this radical listening and this idea of mindfulness as well. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a narrative of the things that I have done, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of a couple resources or things that you can maybe implement in your own class. I will say that from where I'm coming from, I teach writing through the English department. So that's kind of specifically the framework that I'm working through. But hopefully some of this can be helpful to any courses that you might teach in the future and then to yourself as well. So just to give you a little summary of the presentation, we're going to do a quick mindfulness activity. This is something that I would normally do in a course as well to kind of get students situated into the topic at hand, kind of try to get the outside factors away from the present moment as much as possible. So we'll do that quick activity. I'll give you kind of a rundown of what radical listening is, and then give you some ways that I utilize it both in my teaching and in my own learning and pedagogy. And then I have compiled a whole list of resources for you all for further learning. So let's start with that quick mindfulness activity. If possible, if you have a pen or paper handy or a Word document, I like to, when I do some mindfulness and some radical listening, I really like to take notes. So if that's something that's helpful for you, that might be something you want to do. But what we're going to do, I'll give you about 3 minutes or so. We're going to do a quick intention setting activity. I really like to do this for students because intentions are something that focus on the present moment, whereas something like goals, which we talk a lot about in writing, you know, what is your goal for this course? What is your goal in becoming a writer? XYZ, all of those. Thinking about in the present moment, okay, what is your intention for what's happening? So for the next 3 minutes, maybe write down some thoughts. Start by asking yourself what feeling or mindset is most going to benefit you in this present moment, right? Anything that just comes to mind based on what I just said. And then kind of ask yourself, what will you focus your energy on during this presentation? And then I said, in other words, maybe what was your greatest intention for even just attending this presentation? What were you going to focus your energy on the most? So take about 3 minutes and I can play some alpha waves, if that's helpful. Okay, so go ahead and kind of gently bring yourself back from that intention setting activity. I almost said accident. Activity. Um, this is something that I really like to use at the beginning of courses to just get students kind of thinking about, okay, I'm here, I'm logged into Zoom, I'm sitting in this classroom, whatever it may be, what is maybe my intention? And a lot of students struggle with this because they think, especially in a writing course or something like a gen ed, they don't have any intentions going into the day. So I really like to kind of push them, I guess, for lack of a better term, to think about some intentions, because I think that that really does focus your energy in on something to kind of think through as you're going through the lesson. So just something to think about. Let's talk about radical listening. So just by definition, radical listening is listening with curiosity and without defensiveness, and it's often seeking to understand completely. This is kind of the hallmark of what radical listening is. I like to talk about the 3 C's of radical listening, especially with my students, because I think that these are really important to kind of think through, okay, what is this thing that she's asking me to do? So the first C is going to be curiosity. This is just not assuming what the other person has to say. It's going into the conversation curious, not defensive, not thinking that you're going to share your own opinions right away. It's being openly curious about what that other person has to say. So that's kind of step 1. Step 2, and I really like this one, is having the courage to dive deep into the conversation and explore what you never thought of. I like this one because a lot of the times in radical listening, people talk about not being judgmental, which judgmental kind of has that negative connotation. And that's essentially what you're doing by modeling curiosity, by kind of having the courage to dive deep into the conversation and really listen to what that other person has to say. So I really like talking about, okay, let's have the courage to really step up and listen to the exact words that that person is saying. Let's radically listen to what they're trying to say. And then the last one is just having that consciousness. And that's where I think that intentions and mindfulness kind of come into play. This is just not letting your emotions take you away from the moment. It's staying in the present, not thinking about the past, not thinking about the future, being aware of the moment as much as possible. And without consciousness, the first 2 C's of radical listening kind of fail. So just thinking about curiosity, courage, and consciousness. It's also important to note that I have referred to rhetorical or radical listening as radical attentiveness before, just because listening can be seen as an ableist term if you have students who are deaf or hard of hearing. So I have referred to it as different ways, but radical listening is kind of the term that's used in theory today. So if you ever wanted to do research on this, that is the term that's kind of used. But anyway, so I kind of like thinking about radical listening as just getting back to the core of what someone is saying. Today, we are really distracted by everything that's happening around us. We're kind of in this political climate, we're kind of focused in on our own beliefs, and we're really missing the ability to just think about, okay, somebody is saying exactly this without kind of categorizing or offering solutions about what's being said. I struggle with this in my daily life when I have friends that kind of talk to me about things or they come to me with an issue. I always feel like I need to offer a solution, which isn't always true. Sometimes all they need is for me to listen. So radical listening is really getting back to the core of what someone's words are. And this often requires asking questions. So when you genuinely and radically listen, you not only hear what people are saying, you're focused on the way that you can appreciate their meaning and understand what's behind their words, and clarifying what's behind their words. I really like using radical listening in the classroom because I think we can get really defensive about what some people say. And radical listening really has you asking that question, okay, why do you maybe feel that way? Or what belief do you have that maybe has you saying things in this way rather than maybe in this way or something like that? And I'll talk about a little bit with my own pedagogy. This really helps in my grading and thinking about the ways that I can kind of have conversations with students to think about, okay, this student said something that is written down on paper that I thought was maybe really problematic, but is that actually what they meant? So I can kind of radically listen, radically read, I guess, in that context. And instead of immediately categorizing what they had said, I give them the opportunity to kind of answer those questions and kind of tell me what they meant. So your intent is to catch the ball, I kind of like this metaphor, and not immediately throw it back. You're going to sit with it for a little while and kind of think about what that person is saying. So I have, these are kind of some steps, I guess. They're not like, this is how you should do it, and then this, but these are ways that you can kind of think about listening radically with some really, really great kind of dialogue that I really like the way that they talk about this. So the first thing that you're always going to want to do with radical listening is enter into the conversation with a desire to understand, not a desire to win or prove that you are right. So be present, give the speaker your attention, ask questions, be engaged. Know that you don't always have to be right in a conversation, and you don't have to change that person's mind. So think about that as you're radically listening. As Dee says, instead of arguing, try telling your conversation partner, I'd like to understand your opinion about that. Tell me more about where your opinion comes from. And then I really like F as well, when we're talking about having maybe really heated conversations or something that you know you're going to have a strong reaction to, saying, you know, I notice I'm having a strong reaction to what you are saying, but I really want to hear what you have to say. So give me a moment to kind of think things through, maybe do an intention setting activity, do some mindful breathing, and then let's start again. And let's see if we can have this conversation again. So thinking about different ways that you can kind of utilize this both in the classroom and then as yourself as a person. I can be really opinionated, and this is really hard for me. So it's kind of a work in progress. But I've tried some of these things to just listen. I don't have to be right. I don't have to change that person's opinion because I'm probably not going to. Asking, how can I understand this better? So that's kind of broadly what radical listening is. Now I want to give you a little bit of how I kind of utilize radical listening in the classroom. Many of these resources I've adapted to online learning, just as kind of an FYI to that. But I do have, I can definitely talk to how to use radical listening and mindfulness in a physical classroom as well, if this is something we want to talk more about. Something that I usually start with is this idea of mindful reading. Now, again, I teach writing primarily. So my students do a lot of reading as well. So thinking about how you can read with both your mind and your body, and kind of eliminate as many distractions as possible. So I have kind of 3 steps that I always like to, in the physical classroom, kind of walk students through, but then also give them some kind of resources talking about, okay, this is maybe what mindful reading is. It is important to note, and I have found this was kind of a trial and error type thing. Some students don't often have the privilege of mindful reading. So just keep in mind some of these things. You know, I've had a lot of single mothers who, when they have toddlers running around, that's not always something that you can focus your entire mind and your body on, this reading in front of you. So just thinking about ways that you can maybe not push these things onto your students, but implement them into the course in ways that don't distract from everyday life or something like that. So the 3 steps to mindful reading that I like to use is just find a quiet, distraction-free place with little to no ambient noise or motions in the background. Sometimes I'll let students, or I'll tell students that the alpha waves that I played can be nice. Sometimes I like to listen to just instrumental music. I like to listen to music when I read, even though I shouldn't probably, but I do. So thinking about ways that you can kind of focus and help yourself not become distracted. The second is creating a comfortable upright bodily position in which to read. There's a lot of research out there about how when you are upright and your back is straight, you actually breathe easier, which helps you concentrate better. So thinking about ways that you can have kind of a comfortable upright bodily position, which again, and I'm always very transparent with my students, I don't always follow. I like to read in bed. So thinking about ways that you can kind of get yourself upright, focused, think about how you can be mindful as you're reading. And then the last one is just to spend 2 to 5 minutes just breathing mindfully. So that's just really thinking about your breath. So you're taking a breath in, you're holding it, and then you're exhaling out. And it's just trying to focus on that breathing and not letting your mind kind of wander as much as possible. And the more that you keep practicing this, I've used this in the classroom, and students have said it's gotten a lot easier, that when they sit down at their desk and are ready to mindfully breathe, they don't even find their mind wandering as we get practicing. So those are kind of the 3 steps that I like to use to think about mindful reading. this video here, I won't show it because I don't want to run out of time, but I really like these kind of meditation videos. They're cute little animation and they're only about 2 minutes long. I like to show these to students as well. And I have a lot of them listed on our resources if those are anything of interest to you all. The next thing that I really like to focus on, especially in the writing classroom, is this idea that listening is radical. So it's radical listening, but listening is sometimes the most radical thing that we can do. This TED Talk here by Chanel Lewis is really, really important because some of the things that I have students read are not always things that align with their own beliefs or their values, political affiliations, all of these things. So I kind of have students watch this video just to be able to think about, okay, as I read things that might be uncomfortable or they might anger me, how can I maybe think about what Chanel Lewis has done in the past with just being able to listen to what somebody has to say. So I really like that video. You can give it a watch at some point. She's also an excellent speaker. So that's another video that I kind of like to show students at the beginning of the semester, just to say, you know, some of the things that we might read might be uncomfortable, they might be hard to read, but our goal here is just to listen, right? We're radically trying to take in what this person has said and then do with it what we will. As far as 2 other things that I like to do with my students, because we talk about rhetoric, we talk about rhetorical appeals, all of these things, I like to form radical listening into what I call rhetorical listening. So it's just this stance of openness. So thinking about, okay, I'm trying to listen fully to what somebody is saying, but I'm also trying to be open about what they're saying. So this is as much as possible. It's not always possible. Trying to eliminate the constraints of differing perspectives, biases, prejudices, stereotypes, all of these things. To kind of be able to take in these experiences that we might, as individuals, might not have any type of firsthand experience with. I am doing rhetorical listening as I try to take in as much news as possible about what some of the things that are happening in the world. And some of it I don't agree with, and I get really biased, or I could fall into stereotypes and all of these things, but I try as much as possible to have an openness to take in as much of the purpose of the writing as possible, and then to kind of think about it as I move forward. So this is something that we do as well, this idea of rhetorical listening. I say that term all the time. You know, if you're angry about what this person said, how can you rhetorically listen? How can you think about, okay, this is who they are, this is what they said, this is how I'm falling into a bias in that way. And then the last thing that I like to do is author awareness. I always do this for any text that my students read. We do kind of an activity, either they do it on their own or we do it in class, where we talk about who that author is. I think such an important part of radical listening is understanding where that person is coming from, thinking about who they are and how you can relate to them as they're talking. So this is just an example. I've had students read text by Brent Staples and Camila Nontera. So then I've had them do kind of an activity of, okay, what's their profession? What else have they written? What are their works? What are their other works about? And then any sort of biographical information. And then we kind of talk about that. Okay, how can we think about these things as we read their work then? This is where that author is coming from. So those are some examples of ways that I kind of implement this into the writing classroom. Now I want to tell you how I've utilized radical listening in my own pedagogy. So the first step was, as I kind of sat down to think about, okay, radical listening, mindfulness, I wanted this to be an important part of my life. I had to not only radically listen to other people, but radically listen to myself. So this was kind of a really uncomfortable thing that I did, and it's ongoing, like I said, but really kind of listening to, okay, if I reacted badly to what somebody said, do I potentially have any bias? Where do my biases lie in that? This went back to my pedagogy as well. When and how am I listening in the classroom, and when and how am I not? So going back and thinking, okay, that student said something. Did I shut that student down? Did I try to radically listen? How can I be better at radically listening in the future? How might I further listen to where students are coming from when stating opinions, values, knowledge, et cetera, in the classroom? How can I kind of get past my own biases, these things, my own values, these things that I think, and get back to radically listening to who my students are. So that was kind of my first step to radical listening. How I then integrated that into the classroom is I often have multiple points within the semester where I have students reflect. I always read these reflections and I always respond to them in some way. So I have an example here. This is the very first thing that my students do in an online class is they take a quiz, just because that's the easiest way to grade it, a little quiz. And one of the questions just asks, what ideas, subjects, topics, or issues most interest you as a person or as a student? So in this way, they're kind of telling me, okay, these are the things that one, I might potentially write about, but these are also the things that I'm gonna probably have opinions on, which is great. And those are things that I wanna know. So what I'll then do with that information is I often take a few notes on each student, including their major, their definition of writing, as I am in a writing course, any past experiences they have with the course topic. So any previous knowledge that they have, any maybe good or bad experiences that they've had with English in the past, and then any concerns or subjects and ideas and topics that interest them, like I said there. From there, I'll kind of utilize what I've learned from these reflections as I think about the rest of the course, and especially my own pedagogy. So thinking about ways that I can kind of bring in some of these topics to interest the students. So this is how I've kind of implicitly radically listened to who my students are. It means asking questions and then actually listening. So when I have around midterm, I have students kind of reflect about the work of the class thus far. If I have a lot of students who are saying, you know, I don't like the discussion boards. That's something that I really take into account, and we'll maybe have a conversation like, okay, what don't we like about discussion boards? How can I actually listen to what you're saying here, kind of make changes to the course. But the last thing that I kind of want to talk about is what has changed the most, I think, with this idea of radical listening is just how I've graded. So I've done things in the past. Shelley can attest to one of the presentations that I wanted to do was something on like grading contracts or ungrading. So I've done things like that in the past, but with radical listening, what I've actually done is develop a conversation with students via their grades, or via what they've submitted to me, rather, is perhaps more accurate. And this can be really hard for students because often they don't have professors who actually ask them, oh, you said this, can you maybe clarify? Or I have questions about this. You know, a lot of students will just turn that in and then that's the end of it. So it's kind of a thing you got to work through, but this has been twofold in that I'll take those notes that I kind of talked about in the previous slide. So I'll say, and this is an actual note that I had, and I removed the student's name. They enjoyed anything related to flights. They were an aviation major and they spent a lot of their free time flying. The rest of this note said that their experience with English previously was really negative. So thinking about ways that I can kind of radically listen to that. And then I use this as kind of a tool in my grading, I would say, because that particular student had an essay he wrote that even though I kind of understand how flight works, I was unable to really understand what he was trying to say because his knowledge of aviation and flying was so much higher than mine. So we had a really great conversation where I was able to radically listen to him to say, he said, you know, this is where I'm coming from with my knowledge. And then we kind of worked together to see how we could come to a baseline knowledge of that. Not that I think that would have turned into a fight in any way, but thinking about, okay, how can I radically listen to what he has said on paper and then have a conversation as well. And then this was a comment I actually just made last week where I told a student, you know, I'm not really completely following what you're saying here. Could you clarify? And then she had responded and said, oh yes, actually that was a spelling error. So it was kind of a small misunderstanding, right? But something that I could have very much just been like, this doesn't make any sense, instead of having an actual conversation with my students. So I will show you all, and I can put this in the chat as well. I have created and compiled kind of these resources for further learning, and I've categorized them in a little bit as far as radical listening and then mindfulness. So if these are anything that's interesting to you or anything that I've said, I've read most of these or viewed most of these. So a lot of where I'm coming from comes from these sources. They're here for you. So I can share that. And I can give you all editing capabilities. If you find any other sources, I would love to have those shared. Yeah, so that is kind of what I have for you all. As we think about, so I'm open to questions and comments. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but questions and comments that you have. But I will leave you with, as you go about your day today, I ask you, how are you promoting radical listening in your own classroom? How are you promoting radical listening in your everyday life? So just some food for thought.